I'm Miss Ziegler, the Time Machine teacher, and today we're going to talk about Unit 7 of AP World History Curriculum. It's all about global conflicts after 1900. Let's get started with context. Moving into the 1900s, you want to remember the context of what was going on that got us into the 1900s. So, for example, we still had imperialism going on, and there was a lot of tensions with that, and the fact that the countries that were being imperialized, those people are starting to look more towards self-determination and breaking the chains of imperialism. And we also have industrialization, which was a driving force for imperialism and is going to continue to bring about new technology as we go into the 1900s. In the 20th century, we also see political change, social change, and causes that lead up to the First World War. After that, we will have some shift in powers, which we'll talk about in just a second. So let's go into World War I and the context of World War I. This would be from Unit 7.2 if you're following along in the AMSCO book. The causes of World War I, remember we had the acronym MAIN, M-A-I-N. MAIN stands for militarism. That's simply just building up a bigger military and trying to have the biggest and baddest weapons for your country. Then we have A. A stands for alliances. Alliances is making alliances with other countries. Alliances in and of itself were not too big of an issue. The problem was the secret alliances. Secret alliances were a problem because nobody knew about them. And so when one country is drawn into World War I, sometimes their secret alliances are also drawn in, and nobody really knew that that country was going to join because it was, once again, a secret alliance. So just think of an alliance as this country has the other country's back. Imperialism is your I, and that is a cause for World War I because, of course, that brings about tension between countries. This turns into bitter rivalries between nations for global dominance. And then last but not least is the N for nationalism. That's just pride and love for one's country. But it got so strong during this time that people were pretty much willing to do anything for their country. This turns out to be a pretty big problem in these large empires such as the Ottoman Empire because there are so many ethnic groups within those empires. In that example, Serbs were unhappy with the dominance of the Ottoman Empire. Arabs were also tired of the limitations that the Ottoman Empire put on them, and they wanted to rid themselves of that. Both of these groups will seek self-determination, which leads to problems leading up to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which is the match that starts the fire, so to speak, of World War I. After the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the alliances are pulled in and World War I starts. Because of new technology such as poison gas and machine guns, trench warfare was necessary. The problem with trench warfare, well, there was a lot of problems with it. But the big problem with trench warfare is that no one ever really gained any ground. When you're inside a trench, you can't really move that trench. And so this is going to cause a huge stalemate in the war because nobody ever really progresses or advances in the war. The need for the trenches, though, was because of this new technology and how deadly it was. The trenches were protection against that technology. The other issues with trench warfare were the diseases that were spread within the trenches and how muddy and gross they were. The fact that men would sometimes get trench foot from walking around in the water and the muck. Their foot was literally rotting off when they got trench foot. So just the horrible impacts of war on the soldiers. There are several great movies about World War I that you can see more visual aspects of what trench warfare was like, but it was a horrible experience for these soldiers. Many, when they returned home, suffered from shell shock, or what we would call in today's age PTSD, because of the extreme consequences of World War I and being in the trenches for as long as they were. Some other technology that adds to the dangers of World War I were submarines, airplanes, tanks, all of these big machinery type weapons that came out during this time frame. At first, the United States is not a part of World War I. However, there are a couple of events that happened that lead them into World War I. One of those events was the Zimmermann telegram, when Germany tries to get Mexico to declare war on the United States, and the U.S. finds out about it. Another event that leads the U.S. into the war is the sinking of the Lusitania. That was a passenger ship that was bombed by a German U-boat or submarine, And when that happened and several Americans died, the United States was very upset about the fact that they were attacking civilians. In this war, several nations were using a strategy called total war, which means that every resource that they have goes towards the war. And this was in hopes of winning it faster. During this time, there was also a lot of propaganda going around trying to get people to support the war and to entice women on the home front to support the war in whatever way they could, sometimes by going and working in the factories or just preserving whatever they had so that everything could go towards the war. World War I also becomes a global war, and we see the nations that were imperialized are also fighting in the war for whichever side they were imperialized by. Major battles will be fought in North Africa and the Middle East. Japan actually joins the war on the Allied side so that they can hopefully take over the colonies that Germany had imperialized in Asia. Near the end of the war, the Armenian genocide also takes place, where the Ottoman Empire is trying to get rid of the Armenian population, and they kind of blame the war on the Armenian population. Remember, the Armenians are Christians, and the vast majority of the Ottoman Empire were Muslim. And this was a genocide that occurs when they tried to push the Armenian people out and kill thousands. It's also one that the Turkish government denies as happening, but now, currently, just this year in 2021, President Biden put some pressure on the Turkish government about acknowledging that that was actually a genocide. There's more international pressure coming on them now to apologize and to take responsibility for what happened to the Armenians during that time. The war ends with the Treaty of Versailles, and the Treaty of Versailles will have effect on the world for years to come because the Treaty of Versailles is what puts the blame for the war onto Germany. And this is going to be context for Hitler to set the stage for fascism to take over in Germany and for him to come to power and start World War II. The war will also lead to the downfalls of the Russian Empire, and the Russian Revolution happens near the end of World War I. At that time, people were just so tired of fighting the war. They were tired of how the Tsar was handling things, and it gave perfect opportunity for the Bolsheviks to come in and remove the Tsar and take over the country, leading it into communism. Austria-Hungary also falls, and Germany as well is diminished in size. The Ottoman Empire also disintegrates near the end of World War I. Britain takes control of several Ottoman provinces, such as Iraq and Palestine. Germany loses all of its colonies, and the war will eventually lead to decolonization. The new technologies made World War I the most deadly war in all of history. It will lead to the rise of communism and fascism in Europe, as well as China, and it also leads to this shift of power from Europe to the United States. Don't forget, with the Treaty of Versailles also came reparations that Germany had to pay back to the rest of Europe for causing the war. Even though they didn't directly start it, they were still blamed for it. And those reparations were very difficult for them to pay because they had accumulated a lot of loss during World War I as well. And that gives Hitler one other thing to blame the Jews for. After World War I, we get to this period that's called the Interwar Years. This is 7.4 in your AMSCO textbook if you're following along there. The interwar years start in the 1920s with the Great Depression. The Great Depression quickly spreads throughout the world, greatly affects Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin American country, especially the ones that were dependent on the imperial nations for their economies to run well. In the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt proposes the New Deal to get things back on track. And this was a plan for recovery and putting money into building infrastructure around the United States, getting people back to work. There were also problems in Russia. Widespread starvation was taking place, and Lenin knew that their economy was about to collapse, and so he instituted the NEP, which stands for New Economic Plan. In this new economic plan, he allowed farmers to have a little bit more control over selling their goods. It was a small-scale break from communism, but he did this to get the economy back on track. It was mildly successful, you could say, but then Lenin passed away in 1924, and with that, Joseph Stalin will eventually take power. He starts what's called his 5-year plan and starts the Soviet Union, or the USSR. In this 5-year plan, he wants to make the USSR an industrial world power. During that time, he collectivizes agriculture. This is where a group of peasants will work government land or government farms. This enraged farmers because the government was basically taking all of the land, all the farm equipment, everything from them and redistributing it. Farmers actually retaliated against this by burning their crops and killing their animals. Some even moved to the cities to try to have a better life. This led to mass starvation, and collectivization was a huge failure. In 1932, there was mass famine in Ukraine. Millions of people ended up dying from the collectivization of farms there. Stalin was taking all the food out of Ukraine and taking it to other parts of the Soviet Union. He was purposely taking food from the people and not giving it back. They even had policemen and local Communist Party members entering Ukrainian households and taking anything edible from them. Millions died during this famine in Ukraine, if you can call it that, even though it was more of a forced famine on Stalin's part. The borders between Ukraine and the Soviet Union were closed and no one was allowed to escape. To make matters worse, Stalin's regime was very brutal. It's something that has been condemned today, but if you went up against Stalin, you would usually be sent to what was called the gulags, which was a somewhat of a labor camp, usually in Siberia, and most people didn't come back. There was also a time under Stalin's reign called the Great Purge, where he got rid of anyone who didn't agree with him. Literally, they would just disappear. And most of the time, they would either be killed or sent to the gulags. There were also problems between parties in Mexico. As a result of the Mexican Revolution, one political party gained control. That was the Institutional Revolutionary Party. They did have some success from the 1930s to the 1970s, improving the economy. Also in this interwar period, we see a rise of fascism in Italy and Spain. Italy was led by Mussolini. In Spain, it was led by Franco. They both wanted to create a totalitarian state where they would be sole dictators in charge. Franco comes to power through a civil war in Spain where he's actually supported by the Germans. There's also a repressive regime that comes to power in Brazil. Another effect of World War I is all of the unsolved tensions that happened after World War I, namely decolonization and the want to self-determine and self-govern that will start to push the imperialized people to want their own nations. After World War I, the French and the British got power of areas of the Middle East that had once been under the control of the Ottoman Empire. This power was given to them through the mandate system. At the time, as I said, many of these places wanted to decolonize and self-rule. But the French, the British, the United States, the imperialist powers did not want this to happen. They were, however, in favor of Eastern European having self-determination, but not the rest of their colonies. In 1917, the British put forward the Balfour Declaration. This would allow the Jews to move back to Israel and take over the land at that time known as Palestine, making it back into Israel and giving them a homeland. Zionists are the supporters of that, and they would be Jews who would be moving back into Israel. The problem was this is going to cause great tension with the Palestinians who already live there because they're going to either have to accept the fact that the Jews are moving back in and live side by side, or in most cases, they would have to leave. But since this area was British controlled, the Jews from Europe started to move into Israel. And it's going to cause all kinds of tension, which will eventually lead up to wars between the Arabs and the Jewish people. In the 1920s, we see more resistance coming from South Asia, specifically in India. Gandhi brings before the Indian National Congress the wishes to self-govern. He leads a campaign of civil disobedience, where he asks Indians to break the unjust laws in hopes that that protest will work. He also goes on the famous Salt March. The British had made it illegal for the Indians to make their own sea salt, which had been a huge commodity in India previous to colonization. And of course, just like the British, they wanted to monopolize it. On the Salt March, Gandhi and his followers marched to the sea, pick up some salt pieces in response to the unjust laws of the British. During this time, there was also huge tension between the Muslim and Hindu population in India. To solve that problem, it was decided the part that was heavily Muslim would become Pakistan. Pakistan and India don't get their independence until after World War II, but the anti-colonial movement definitely happens during this interwar period. The March 1st movement happens in Korea, where Koreans are trying to get their independence from the Japanese. The Japanese shut it down in a very brutal way, but it sparks Korean nationalism even more. There are also issues in China, as the Chinese Communist Party is fighting the Nationalist Party for power in China. The Communist Party is led by Mao Zedong, and they are defeated by the nationalists and sent on the Long March. It was an almost 6,000-mile retreat. At that time, the Communist Party was pretty much devastated, but the peasants found renewed strength in the fact that Mao wanted to continue the fight. As the communists were retreating and the nationalists were taking over more of the power, the leaders of the Nationalist Party, specifically Chiang Kai-shek, wanted more traditional ways, and he was really pushing Confucianism, which alienated the Chinese population at that time because they were getting less and less traditional. Those opposing him also criticized him for the fact that he didn't support free speech. In 1935, the Communists and the Nationalist Party stopped fighting each other so that they could fight Japan instead. There was also resistance in West Africa against the French, specifically in Senegal. African intellectuals that had studied in Europe, Jomo Kenyatta and Leonardo Senghor, were against the colonial governments and the racial discrimination that came along with it. The workers staged strikes against the Europeans, and this happened throughout the French West African coast. All of these unresolved tensions from World War I lead us into World War II and set the stage for that war. This specifically happens in the rise of Hitler to power. Hitler comes to power with claims that he will make Germany return to its former glory. He is upset by the fact that they lost the war, and he blames the Jews for losing the war as well as the communists. He uses them as a scapegoat for Germany's problems. The Great Depression further puts more stress on the German people, and these ideas that Hitler has about how to return the country to the former glory are definitely popular for the German people. Hitler's hatred for the Jews are based on genetic race science, and he has extreme anti-Semitism towards them. He fills his speeches with hatred for the Jews and blaming them for the war. Once he gets into power, he passes the Nuremberg laws. These are laws to discriminate against the Jews and set them apart from everyone else. This is a huge warning sign that a possible genocide could happen, where the government separates out a group of people. So pay attention to that in the future. If you ever see that happening, you know that that's a possibility that something worse could happen in the future. In 1938, Kristallnacht takes place. This is called the Night of Broken Glass. Hitler basically gives his troops the permission, and the German people as a whole, to attack Jewish-owned businesses and synagogues, and it's a very scary time to be Jewish in Germany. More than 30,000 Jews were dragged from their homes and taken to concentration camps that night. Despite the Treaty of Versailles saying that he couldn't, Hitler also starts to expand the military. The British kind of take this attitude of appeasement toward Hitler, that maybe if they give him a little bit of what he wants, that he'll stop at that. The unfortunate thing is, he didn't stop. In 1938, he annexes Austria. He also demands that Czechoslovakia give back the Sudetenland, which is where a lot of Germans lived. And because of appeasement, he's given that area back in the Munich Agreement. It's then that he moves his eyes towards Poland and wanting to take that area over. And the British decide that appeasement should be done. They promise to protect Poland. In 1939, Hitler forms the Non-Aggression Pact with the Soviet Union, saying, if you don't attack us, we won't attack you. Hitler and Stalin agree that they will somewhat split Poland between themselves. With that, Germany attacks Poland. Britain and France had promised to protect Poland, and at that point, World War II officially begins in Europe. In Asia, the aggressive action that Japan had taken against China and Korea within the last 50 years was also causing a lot of tensions in that area. It will quickly escalate and World War II begins in Asia. Once the war starts in 1939, the Japanese start to get a little bit more aggressive in going after European and US interests in Asia. Japan's occupation of China led to the US sanctioning them, and they really relied heavily on the US for things like oil and iron. Because of these sanctions, Japan's expansion was threatened, and that's when they start planning military action against the United States. Germany has some early victories, and they use a method called Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg means lightning war, which basically means having tanks roll in to subdue the area and air power to protect the tanks. It's a very quick way of taking over an area. Hitler has a lot of success with this and eventually takes over Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The French government is allowed to stay in power in a way. They're kind of like a puppet government. In 1940, Hitler wants to take over Britain, and he starts the Battle of Britain. He targeted military bases at first, and then eventually will turn towards the civilian population. In response to the attack on Britain, the British attack Berlin with an air raid. Since the Germans turned their attack more towards the cities, the military had time to regroup, and the British are able to destroy enough of Germany's planes that Hitler has to withdraw. Because of his failure here in Great Britain, Hitler decides that despite the non-aggression pact, he's going to attack the Soviet Union. He's trying to build for himself Lebensraum, which means living space for the German people. At first, the attack on the Soviet Union goes very well, but what he fails to remember is that Russian winters are very harsh. If he would have been reading his history book, he would have known that Napoleon had the same problem, and he wouldn't have repeated the same mistake. But clearly, he didn't pay attention that day in class because he made the exact same mistake as Napoleon. When it was too close to winter, the Russian winter took a huge toll on the German troops, and the Soviets were able to hold on to their territory. December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, and this will bring the United States into the war. It also brings about internment camps of the Japanese, which are more like concentration camps, because it was forced imprisonment of the Japanese, Germans, and Italians that were here in the United States. On the home front, many women are working in factories and making weapons for the war. Also, there's huge propaganda for making sure that you're supporting the war by buying bonds and growing victory gardens so that you'll have enough produce, and that way more supplies can be sent to the army. In the Pacific, the U.S. uses a strategy called island hopping, where they attack islands that were least fortified as they make their way towards Japan. The development of aircraft carriers was major for the war in the Pacific because it allowed airplanes to take off from sea, and that gave the Navy more versatility. June 6, 1944 is celebrated as D-Day. This is when U.S. troops invaded Normandy from England. They were able to take over France from the German powers that had invaded it. That winter, there was one more push by the Germans. It was called the Battle of the Bulge, but the Allies won, and at this point, Hitler knew it was probably not possible for him to win the war. The end of the war in Europe happens April 30th, 1945. That is supposedly when Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. However, there has been some theory that maybe he escaped to Argentina. That's an interesting conspiracy theory to check out if you ever have the time. The U.S. drops 2 atomic bombs in Japan, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in 1945, and this ends the war in Japan. The Japanese unconditionally surrendered on August 14th. A total of 140,000 estimated Japanese deaths occurred as a result of dropping those 2 bombs. September 2nd is designated VJ Day, which means Victory in Japan Day. World War I had been deadly because of technology. However, World War II is one of the bloodiest wars in history because of the amount of deaths. The official statistics say that 75 million people died in World War II, 2/3 of which were civilians. It also is going to bring about problems with international relations, racism, decolonization, and because of the shift in power after the end of World War II, where the US and the USSR, or the Soviet Union, are the major powers, it sets the stage for the Cold War. Unit 7.8 talks about mass atrocities that happened during this time frame. In 1918, at the end of World War I, when soldiers start to come home, they bring with them the Spanish flu, which will turn into a pandemic similar to the one that we experienced in 2020 with the coronavirus. Believe it or not, there was a lot of debate about wearing masks at that time too, just like there was in 2020. The Spanish flu became a worldwide pandemic, and over 20 million people were killed. Because of Hitler, the Holocaust occurred. During the Holocaust, 6 million Jews lost their lives, and another 5 million non-Jews who Hitler targeted also lost their lives. It was a devastating time in Germany and throughout the areas that Germany had taken over. The Holocaust put a renewed push towards developing Israel, or a homeland for the Jews, and we'll see that happen after World War II, when there's more tension between those already living there in Palestine and the Jews who want to make it Israel. The Japanese politics didn't result in technically a genocide, but they did kill millions in their process of going through China and trying to gain power. They had a program called Asia for the Asiatics, where they took conquered people and put them in labor programs under their command. Many civilians died in these programs. Air warfare carried out by the Allies also caused civilian deaths. Despite the fact that the global community did not support the Holocaust and said that they would never allow it to happen again, there have been genocides since. This happens in 1980 after the Soviet Union collapses. Serbian nationalists are pushing for ethnic cleansing of the Muslim population in Bosnia-Herzegovina. During this time, over 300,000 people died. Another genocide that happened as a result of colonialism was the Rwandan genocide in 1994. This is where the Hutus gained power and went up against the Tutsis. During colonialism, Belgian colonizers treated the Tutsis better than the Hutus. And after decolonization, the Hutus wanted to get revenge. This happened as a result of the Rwandan president, who was a Hutu, dying in a plane crash. It was said that rebel forces shot down his plane, and that was enough to start the Rwandan genocide. Between 500,000 to 1 million civilians were killed in this genocide. This one also started in the same way that the Holocaust started. They separated the Hutus and the Tutsis by putting an identification on their ID cards of which tribe they were a member of. That way, when the Rwandan genocide started, they could easily tell who was who. Once again, keep that warning sign in mind. If you see that happening anywhere around you, you know that it's a possibility that it could lead to things getting worse. Another threat to human rights started in 2003 in Sudan, in an area called Darfur. Most involved in this were Muslim, but some were Arab pastoralist. Rebel groups started to attack pastoralist groups. The government of Sudan was controlled by Arab Muslims. Two rebel groups took up arms against the Sudanese government. In response, the government sent out the Janjaweed, Arab militants. The Sudanese military and the Janjaweed attacked thousands of villages, slaughtering more than 200,000 people, mostly non-Arab. More than 1 million people have been displaced as a result of the conflict. So as you can see, although the international world was disgusted and horrified by the Holocaust, genocides have still taken place since. It is our job as citizens of the world to keep our eyes open and to protest the human rights violations that are taking place in our world today. I believe that it's a failure of the international community to keep an eye on these things. And as good citizens, we need to make sure that we're aware so that we can write our representatives and put pressure on our government to pressure the international community against countries who are violating human rights. One other thing to keep in mind with Unit 7 is that we have a lot of causation going on. Several dominoes falling into place to cause something else. For example, the causes of World War I leading into World War I and how all those play a part. That you can remember with the acronym MAIN, as well as the causes that happened during the interwar years that lead up to World War II, the Great Depression, and how that leads to the rise of fascism. A lot of causation happening here that you need to keep in mind. And last but not least, the causation of the end of World War II that will lead us up to the Cold War. The switch of power from Europe to the US and the Soviet Union being the most dominant. And we'll talk about that in Unit 8. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you do so. Hit that notification bell so that you don't miss a thing. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great day. With the spark, and several Americans died when that sick shank. After World War I, the French self-determining